We are digitizing some artwork, but the lighting doesn't look quite right. There's a distracting bright spot, a reflection of the light source, and we need to get rid of it. It turns out we're always dealing with three kinds of reflections. Diffuse reflections, which are the light rays that allow us to see things. We're not talking about a diffused light source, but a diffusion of the light as it bounces off the microscopic texture of an object. It reflects equally in all directions, which is why you can stand in any part of the room and see the artwork. It's the diffuse reflections that we want to take a photograph of. There are other types of reflection, and they're the ones we usually don't want. Direct reflections are like looking at your light source through a mirror. And unlike diffuse reflections, we can only see them when we're standing in certain positions in the room relative to the light and the plane of the object. Thirdly, we might have the glare of a polarized reflection. These are dimmer than the direct reflection of the light source, and they depend on what the subject is made of and whether the light source itself is polarized or not. I'll address that in another video, but we'll be addressing direct reflections in this one. Understanding how reflections bounce isn't just for taking photographs of art, but any shiny objects in product photography and even portraits of people wearing glasses. Light bounces off surfaces like a ball. Here's a classic example of a snooker table or a pool table or a billiard table or any other game where you've got to bounce a ball off a wall or a cushion. We have an imaginary line called a normal, and it's at right angles to the table's cushion. If we strike the ball at a low incidence angle to the normal, it bounces off at a low angle. If we strike it at a high angle, it bounces back at the same high angle. The ball behaves exactly like light behaves when it reflects off a surface. The angle of incidence is equal to the angle of reflection. And knowing that can get us out of a lot of sticky situations. Let's replace the imaginary cushion with some flat artwork. And now the ball is our light source. The pocket is a camera with an 85mm lens on it, and we've filled the frame with the artwork. Light can bounce off the artwork and enters the camera just like pocketing a billiard ball. The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. If the light were right next to the camera, it's intuitive that you'd pick up its reflection in the photo. But there's actually a whole suite of angles where the camera can see the reflection of the light source. The limits are the very last point at either side of the artwork where the camera could possibly see a reflected light if it were there. Hunter et al. In their book Light, Science and Magic call this a family of angles that produce a direct reflection. And this book is well worth a read for any photographer. I'll leave a link to where you can find it in the description below. The family of angles shows us a zone of danger where we will see direct reflections. If we move the light source out of the zone, the light no longer has a direct path to the artwork and the camera won't see it anymore. We're left only with the diffused reflections that we need to see the photograph. A tiny light is easy to move around. What if we had a huge light source like a window behind us? Usually we can't move a window, so we'd have to move or rotate the artwork to ensure the window isn't in the family of angles. Windows are relatively large, so it's harder to avoid their reflection. What if the window's on a side wall? The reflections might be really difficult to avoid, and we'd make life easier for ourselves just to close the blinds and use smaller light sources. You can imagine there are many ways the situation could get more complicated. What happens if the camera's not centered? Well, then it makes an asymmetrical family of angles. In this case, we can have the light at the bottom of the diagram closer to the camera, but the light on the top side has to be moved further away if we want to avoid its reflection. Not to mention that art would then be horizontally distorted from perspective, so we'd have to correct that with a shift lens or a perspective correction in post-production. What happens if we don't have a long lens, or we're using a phone where the normal lens gives a higher quality image than the telephoto lens? Let's go back to the original simple setup and let's change the 85mm for a 35mm lens. If we leave the camera in the same position, nothing about our light setup changes, and that's because perspective and angles all depend on the location of the camera, not what lens is attached to it. But with a wider lens, the artwork doesn't fill the frame anymore, which wastes pixels. So we need to move the camera closer, and that changes everything. Now, when we trace the family of angles that show direct reflections, the danger zone is wider. The lights have to be moved further out to get an image without direct reflections. So standing back as far as possible with the longest lens possible is much more forgiving. If you're forced to be close to the artwork, or if the side walls force the lights to be close to the camera, we're at the limit of what playing with angles can do. Hunter et al. In their book mention the pitfall of thinking about the position of the light only as an angle from the subject. And that's clearly faulty, because if we have a light at a 45-degree angle from an artwork close in, then it's in the family of angles and we'll see the light source through the camera. If it's at 45 degrees pushed further back, then it's out of the danger zone. The angle combined with the distance from the subject is what we really need to consider relative to the reflections family of angles. We might be tempted to keep the light source as far from the camera as possible to create a really low angle of incidence and reflection. We'll definitely avoid direct reflections, but now we've created two new problems. Firstly, if the artwork has any texture, the raking light will create micro shadows. And this might be desirable depending on your art and your intentions. Secondly, the piece will be unevenly lit. It will be much brighter on one side than the other. And this highlights the importance of using a second light on the other side of the camera to even out the brightness. You could even out the brightness in post-production, but that can and will get messy. Remember that through the inverse square law, a light that's close to the subject will show a greater degree of fall off or brightness difference from one side to the other than a light that's further back. An ideal setup is a camera with as long a lens as possible, lights positioned outside the family of angles, and a symmetrical light setup for even brightness. Though you can show texture, if you'd like, by positioning the lights at a lower angle to the artwork and having one light brighter than the other. Please watch out for other videos I'll be making in this series where we will look at circular polarizers to combat glare, the ideal camera settings to use, and how to honour and preserve the colours of the art.